So welcome to the chat, Dr. Milligan White.
Thank you.
Well, the topic of our session today is the development of China's diplomacy over the past 75 years. But let's start with the latest events. So tell us what has impressed you most recently in terms of China's diplomatic efforts.
Well, it's attempting to calm down its trading partners in the developed world because it has a government that's capable of very successful long-term economic planning and a population that's 4 times larger than the American population and as large as the whole European population. And China's success economically, technologically, is moving far faster than the developed world ever anticipated. So it's attempting to deal with its tremendous success.
Right. And what about, President Xi's European tour? Have you paid attention to that?
Well, he basically is going to Eastern Europe as well as certain key Western Europe countries. And essentially saying, if you basically want to just fall in line with the Americans, we in China can be self-sufficient, but we do need to buy a lot of Airbuses. And we're not going to be buying Boeing unless, but if necessary, we'll just use, we'll use 919s and not do business with either of you.
Are you, to any extent, impressed by his trip to France and his, all the big events or activities he had there?
Well, I think President Macron is realizing the significance of the historic moment that they may be very close to. See China's diplomacy as being a stabilizing influence. Its trading partners in the developed world are increasingly unstable. The Europeans are terrified that they're going to have military conflict and they aren't really able to defend themselves. So I think the subtext is that Macron is hoping that he can reach some sort of an understanding with Xi that on one hand basically allows, they're searching for stability. I think President Xi is also searching for stability, but it's more economic stability. The Europeans, particularly the Western Europeans, that he's focusing on are terrified that the Americans are going to withdraw from NATO, and Russian pride is going to reassert itself in a way that is very destabilizing to Europe. So I suspect that she can have a major role. How else can Macron persuade Putin to not keep going after Ukraine?
But when it comes to China and France getting closer, do you see any concern, rising from Washington? Do you see it may trigger any ripple effects?
Well, Washington is a megatron of ripple effects, and a lot of its policies are self-defeating. So whatever China does that amounts to being economically or militarily successful will cause Washington tremendous anxiety.
So you don't see it as some, any noise arising from it, or?
Well, I think the essence of the relationship between China and the United States was captured by something that Larry Summers said in the New York Times in 2019. He pinpointed 4 questions. First question is, can the United States imagine a viable global economy in 2050 in which the US economy is half the size of the largest economy in the world? Secondly, could any American political leader acknowledge that reality in a way to have a meaningful conversation about how a viable American and global economy could work? The third thing he pointed to was that could Americans stand being outstripped so significantly economically and geopolitically? And the fourth question was, could the Americans do anything to stop such a thing, a success, without destroying America? Those are the very core of the difficulty between the United States and China. China has 4 times the population. It has, in the words of Eric Schmidt, who was the head of Google and is one of the key advisors of the American government, there are just too many smart people in China. China's ahead in 7 out of the 8 major high-tech areas. So there's a major transition going on. The Americans displaced the English as the world leaders. Now the Chinese are displacing the Americans as the world leaders, both economically, technologically, and in terms of geopolitics. That is a return to normal. For 38 of the last 40 centuries, China has had the largest economy and the most technologically advanced economy in the world. So this transition, the Americans don't have a solution. The Europeans are not, on the one hand, they want to sell a lot of Mercedes and Porsches and Volkswagens in China. On the other hand, if they try to stop China from selling electric vehicles in Europe, that leads to a very bad result, because China has a big enough internal market that just by spreading car ownership internally, it's already going to be the largest market for cars. So there's this adjustment that the developing world is shocked. A country that has a socialist government in a single generation has gone from being the 150th poorest, one of the 10 poorest nations in the world, to about to have the second and soon the largest economy in the world with socialism. How is this possible? There's something terribly unfair about China's success from the perspective of the developed world.
Right, it's going to take them some time to digest the whole thing, right?
2 or 3 generations.
Right. So enough about the warm-up part, and turning to the we'll have more about Sino-U.S. interaction later on, but now turning to our the general evaluation of China's trajectory of China's diplomacy over the past 75 years. What's your overall assessment?
Basically, China has always, in my knowledge, seen itself since 1949 as the leader of the developing world. That was discussed at the North-South divide was a major theme. It used a theory of equality called Marxism to create a stable government. And Mao gave China its sovereignty. Deng Xiaoping said communism can't mean poverty. We have to have socialism with Chinese characteristics, and we have to grow our economy. If we can't grow our economy, we're not going to be able to provide a stable government for our people. So that went along very well. Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao sort of, then along came another leader of genius, Xi Jinping, and said, well, we have to focus on 8 major technological areas. And we can't just have our own success. We have to lead, going back to the roots of Chinese diplomacy, we have to be a leader of the developing world. So we're going to have things like the Belt and Road and the AIIB and BRICS and the New Development Bank, which is, on the one hand, each of those policies is a stroke of genius for maintaining China's internal economic development, but also a stroke of genius in enabling its trading partners in the developing world to share its success.
You mentioned that China intends to be the leader of the developing world, but on the Chinese side, probably we don't have that, thought in the first place. We just want to, maybe China just wants to set an example that a developing country can manage to do or accomplish all those things, right? But it's just turned out that we developed a little bit faster than other countries in that sense. Well, then, in your opinion, so what have been the most significant diplomatic achievements or milestones of China during this period?
Well, I was very impressed with Mao's ability to unite the country with a theory of equality. I was extremely impressed in 1997 when I began thinking about China. The only statesman in the world that I found had a theory about how the future of mankind could work was Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping said, no, we're not going to have a nuclear war. Our problem is economic development. So that nobody, in 1978, China was in pretty bad shape. And none of the generals, basically, and leaders of the party knew what to do with it. But even Mao had told Brezhnev that Deng Xiaoping would be the future leader of China. There's a wonderful excerpt from Deng Xiaoping's 3rd volume of selected works where he's talking to the president of Hungary. And he's saying, there were a bunch of farmers down in, and they decided to do their collective farming, but also farm on privately on the side, and the productivity went way up. So Deng Xiaoping didn't really know how to solve the problem, but he took the generals down to see these farmers, and the generals realized, well, none of us know how to run an economy. Other than Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping, none of us have really been educated outside of China. They happened to be in a work study program in France in 1917. So they bestowed on Deng Xiaoping this, if any of us can figure it out, it's this guy, so we're all going to support him. That sort of mindset change, the ability to, okay, our country, we care about people. Our country is poor. It's not going to have a stable government unless it can grow economically. How can we do that? So we're going to produce a leader of the quality of Deng Xiaoping who says, well, we're not going to get ready for the next nuclear war. We're basically going to focus on economic development. That is, genius is something that's obviously true, compelling, which no one ever thought of before. So we have that push. Now, China was always talking about, in those early years, the North-South divide. So that theme, in my view, has continued, and the Belt and Road and AIIB is basically the continuation of what used to be called, when I was in university, the North-South divide.
Right. Actually, how to improve people's livelihood is not just what we did over the past few decades. That's what the Chinese nation been dedicated or been seeking over the past like you said, 38,000 years for all. So you mentioned this Belt and Road initiative. I think recently on social media there was this there's a viral video featuring Daniel Rund, the senior vice president of the U.S. Center for Strategic and International Studies, who once commented on China's BRI. He said, quote unquote, BRI is an ambitious and hopeful project. I hate it because it's a great idea, because it inspires folks in the global south. It's just not our idea. So from being questioned to being accepted by more than 150 countries and being imitated, if you will, by the US and its allies, the Belt and Road Initiative is regarded by some observers as the most ambitious and successful diplomatic effort China has made in the past decade. So from your perspective, what's the significance of this initiative when looking at it more than a decade after its launch?
Again, I see it as a stroke of genius. How do you continue your domestic economic growth? How do you expand your economic reach? So China produces a leader, and he says, well, we should have a Belt and Road project where we invest all this excess foreign capital we're generating with our trade in developing the infrastructure in our trading partners, both in the developing world and the developed world. So it's a very, very wise and noble policy. I think the realization, basically, that it's a very successful idea. The Western media likes to say, oh, it won't work, it's bad, but it speaks for itself. It is very successful.
In terms of?
Well, the IMF and the Asian Development Bank were not really providing the economic wherewithal for developing countries to have the infrastructure to develop. And if you don't have infrastructure, you don't develop. China, as a developing country itself, understands the critical importance of infrastructure, and it's using its success to fund other countries' success.
But it's not like it's China who's been, developing this project. Like the U.S. also got similar projects too, right? Why hasn't, or let me put it this way, why have the developing countries, accepted, if you will, the BRI instead of, or laud those provided by the states and its allies?
Well, the background, of course, is colonialism and racism. So the countries that benefited first from the Industrial Revolution, England and then America, and other countries created colonies, and China was a victim of that attempt to colonize China, and it rejected that. The Americans did the Marshall Plan, which is analogous to the Belt and Road, because they were fighting the Russians and communism. But the developing world really wanted to keep the developing countries poor and to exploit them. So China basically, as a developing country, realizes it is part of the South, it is part of the developing world. It just happens to be, as you said, the most successful of the developing countries because it has a very effective government. And the Europeans and the Americans, there was a view, basically, there was a thesis that in order to have economic development, you had to have capitalism. Now, in a capitalist country, like the United States, for example, capitalism controls politics and public policy. In China, its political system, socialism, controls capitalism, public policy, and politics. And as a result of socialism controlling politics, public policy, and capitalism, in a single generation, China has gone from having a GDP of about a billion people with $278 billion a year in 1978 to having 14 or 15 trillion dollars. No one in the world has ever produced so much economic growth in its size, speed, and global impact as this socialist government in China. So this is a new way of modernizing, and it ends the monopoly that the capitalist countries thought, oh, you have to basically let us own you before, if you're going to economically progress. And by the way, we're not going to let you economically progress. China's come along and said, no, well, we're a socialist country and we've economically progressed, so we will invest in your success also. And we don't care what kind of a government you have, as long as, you basically are wanting to develop.
And so you're saying that the logic behind, the two different projects provided by two, I should say, countries are basically different.
Yes. There's a view basically that in order for me to win, you have to lose. The Chinese approach is, well, in order for me to win, you have to win. And we call that socialism with Chinese characteristics. In the United States, according to recent studies by Harvard and Princeton, less than 1% of Americans control public policy and politics. And the result is a very unstable society. In China, Harvard did a survey from 2000 to 2016, and we're absolutely staggered. They found that the popular support for the Chinese government went from 86% in 2000 to 93% in 2016. And this basically, they were thinking, from the Western point of view, if China broke up into a series of provinces, it could be easily dominated. So they're very much against the success of the Communist Party of China, implying socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now, for me, what I found, I read a book 50 years ago in university that explained to me what's going on in China. Plato wrote a book called The Republic 2,300 years ago.
Right.
And he said, basically, if you want to have a society that's not always at war, internally and externally, you should pick a group of guardians, and they should be judged throughout their careers by their behavior and their commitment to the well-being of the society. So when I look at the Communist Party of China, I see it, I call it the Guardian Party of China. And it has, in order to get anywhere where you're close to making high-level decisions in China, you have to have about 38, 40 years of successful experience. And unlike, one of the reasons I like China is it has a government that is capable of successful long-term economic planning. And what isn't understood either by most Chinese, what isn't understood by most Chinese and by almost all foreigners is why the Chinese system of government works. And in my opinion, it works because there are three continuous feedback loops from the bottom to the top, from the bottom to the top. Within the, what I call China's Guardian Party, there are 96 million members, and it's constantly gathering information about what are the problems, what policies are working, what policies are needed. Then you have in the NPC another continuous feedback loop doing the same thing. And then in the CCPPC, you have a third feedback loop. So these are perceived, the NPC and the CCPC are perceived by Westerners as simply rubber stamps for what the CPC is doing, when, in my view, the success of how did China in a single generation create 800 million people out of poverty, 400 million of which into the middle class? It did this because of the successful feedback loops within these three organizations. So in my view, China has the most effective, most representative, and most responsible government that I'm aware of. And the IMF notes that nobody has alleviated poverty to the degree that the Chinese government has just in a single lifetime.
You're saying that's most representative, that it's most representative of the whole nation, of the, the 1.4 million people, right?
Billion, yeah.
Right, you're saying that the CPC is the guardians of the country. But when it comes to, other developing countries, the West is questioning whether they can be the guardian also of those developing countries. They're saying that China creates this BRI and used it as a debt trap. So from your perspective, is it valid argument?
Well, in any society, whether it's 330 million Americans or 1.4 billion Chinese, you have to have representatives. The problem is, how do you pick the representatives, and how do you ensure that they are working for the interest of the people? Lincoln had this ideal of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. America, according to the Harvard and Princeton studies that I mentioned a minute ago, doesn't succeed in having, you can vote, but it doesn't affect the public policy outcomes, which are determined, according to those studies, by less than 1% of Americans. So the whole idea that you could have a socialist government that lifted 800 million people out of poverty in one generation is terrifying to the developed nations. To the developing nations, it's inspiring. The issue about, well, is China creating a debt trap? I think that the IMF and the World Bank created debt traps, and that led to the Asian financial crisis. It was the Americans that produced the 2008 financial crisis. I don't see the same level of irresponsibility in the way China is investing globally. And I also see there have been studies which point out the stages that the BRI has gone through. The first stage, the second stage, the third stage. You have the expansion of BRICS. You have the AIIB. You have the new development bank. The world is changing just in the last 10 years in a way that is inspiring to the 260 developing nations, absolutely terrifying to America, many of the Western European countries, Japan and Australia and New Zealand, because they're no longer able to dominate. Colonialism isn't working anymore. And in fact, their own systems of government are unstable. The Chinese system of government, there was Zelek, who was an undersecretary of the Treasury and went on to be head of the World Bank, commented about 15 years ago, the problem is it's hard to persuade the Chinese to stop doing what they're doing because it's working.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Why? Yeah, the Chinese Communist Party or the government of China can be the guardians of the Chinese people, but why does it have to be the guardians of other countries?
It's not. It's not. I don't think what China has accomplished is replicable in other countries. You have to have a 5,000-year sort of imperial history, then have foreigners try to take over your country, spontaneously manage to fight off the warlords and the foreigners with a theory of equality called communism. You then have to have the mindset change to say, well, we don't want everybody to be equally poor. We want to create economic development. We'll call that socialism with Chinese characteristics. Then you have to have somebody who says, well, we better be careful, because if capitalism starts controlling socialism, public policy, and politics, China's going to come apart. So you have a leader now who said, okay, let's slow down the emerging power of the Chinese capitalists. Now, your comment was, I think China leads by example. Sometimes it's a little heavy-handed, but that's the nature of governments. The Americans are heavy-handed. The Europeans are heavy-handed. The Russians are heavy-handed. So when I compare, I think China doesn't have to be as heavy-handed as it sometimes is, because it has a moral authority. I think the real power that China will have in the future, and the key to its continued success, is its moral authority, both with its own population. That's where the anti-corruption and common prosperity attempt to preserve the moral authority of the existing system of government. I don't see, basically, as I said, I see the developing world looking at China not as dominating it, but as inspiring it. I think, as I said, for the developed world that's used to being, there's an old saying that the powerful do what they want and the weak suffer what they must.
I'm saying that, asking whether China is trying to be or can be the guardians of those countries by providing such a project as the BRI.
Well, it's doing two things. It's helping its own economy grow by making sure its neighbors' economies grow. That doesn't sound like a bad thing to me.
Right. All right. Talking about those international organizations, China's joining or rejoining those organizations, such as the World Trade Organization or the United Nations, were absolutely regarded as something or milestones in this country's diplomacy, right? And so my question is, what role has China played in shaping or reshaping, if you will, regional and global diplomatic norms and institutions?
Well, I think it's again Deng Xiaoping who realized that socialism can't mean everybody is got a per capita income of less than $300 a year. So he says we've got to open up. We need foreign investment. So he persuades the Americans, starting with Carter, culminating with Clinton, with a little help from Goldman Sachs along the way, to let China into the WTO. The WTO was really designed for the developed countries to exploit the developing countries. The Americans and the Europeans are quite upset because, you mean you make better cars than we do? This is dumping. We should be able to sell Porsches and Mercedes and Volkswagens in China. In fact, if we can't, we're out of business, our own domestic car companies. But you've come along with electronic vehicles that help with climate change. So this shocks us. So there's an adjustment process going on. As I said, China it has to cope with its own success, and it has to help the people who are negatively affected by its success, like the Americans and the Europeans, keep the economic stability that they need. Going back to Larry Summers's 4 questions. If you have America becoming half the size of the largest economy, how can America remain stable? China cannot achieve its own goals in 2049 unless it also ensures that there is a stable global economy in 2050. So it used to be that China just had to worry about how to get China to grow. Now it has to do both. It has to help its trading partners grow, and that's where Belt and Road, AIIB, New Development Bank, and BRICS come in. However, those things upset the Americans and the European Union and the IMF and the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, because China's it's better at funding economic development, and its goals are more broadly spread than the traditional World Bank, IMF, and system. What I call the old school of U.S.-China relations. Its goals are to preserve America's economic and military dominance. The occurrence of the global financial crisis, the failure of America in its wars, and the facts on which the old school goals are based. So the new school focuses on how to align the economic and national security of the 2 largest economies. China is capable of successful long-term economic planning. America is incapable of successful long-term economic planning. Because it's incapable.
This is CGTN Radio. Hear the difference.